Right, good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie Lindsay, and as the chairman of UKAS, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar with the title, Setting the Bar, How Accreditation Can Help Build a Safer Future. And it is organized, this morning's event is organized jointly by the Construction Industry Council, the CIC, and UKAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. Following the dreadful events at Grenfell Tower in June 2017, Dame Judith Hackett published a report some 11 months later with the title, Building a Safer Future, an independent review of building regulations and fire safety. In her report, Dame Judith laid bare a number of systemic shortcomings and concluded that the regulatory system for higher risk buildings was not fit for purpose. One of the key findings was that there is no consistent way to verify the competence of people working on these buildings. In the 2 years since her report, under the watchful eye of Dame Judith and with the support of government, a huge amount of work has been done by industry bodies to address these issues. This work culminated in the document, Setting the Bar, a New Competence Regime for Building a Safer Future, and that document was published last month. I'd like to pay tribute to Graham Watts, as chair of the Competence Steering Group, and to the numerous contributors to the steering group and the working groups, many of whom are attending today, for playing their part to bring this report to fruition. And we'll be hearing from Graham Watts later this morning. Nevertheless, despite the considerable progress that has been achieved so far, there is still a long way to go. There are also many challenges ahead, not least with the implementation of the Building Safety Bill, which was published as a first draft in July. Again, we will hear more about this shortly. One of the key recommendations contained in the Setting the Bar report is that an overarching competence framework is required, and that professional and trade bodies who certify or register member organizations should themselves be accredited or licensed by a suitable oversight authority, such as UKAS or the Engineering Council. And this is what today's webinar is about. In a moment, Damien Dacey from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government will provide a central government view of the Building Safety Programme, followed by Tim Galloway, the Deputy Director of Building Safety for HSE, who will update us on progress on setting up the Building Safety Regulator. We were expecting to hear from Peter Baker, HSE's Director of Building Safety and Construction, but he has been called away to a ministerial meeting, and we are very grateful for Tim stepping in at short notice. We will then hear about Setting the Bar from Graham Watts, Chief Executive of the Construction Industry Council, and then from UKAS, when my colleagues Matt Gantley and Malcolm Hind will explain the role of UKAS in relation to this work. Before taking a 10-minute break at 11:30, there will be a question and answer session at which the speakers will also be joined by Katie Turf, Head of Professional Standards at the Engineering Council, and Stephen Adams, Chief Executive of the BAFE Fire Safety Register. If you could please submit any questions using the Zoom chat function, we will endeavour to answer as many as time permits. Then after the 10-minute break, you have a choice. For those who have had little previous experience to third-party accreditation and licensing, I suggest you join breakout session 1, which will be facilitated by UKAS and the Engineering Council. Alternatively, if you're already familiar with the subject and perhaps already hold some accreditation, I suggest you join breakout session 2. Both of these breakout groups will provide an opportunity to ask questions and find out more. You'll find the login details for these 2 breakout groups in the agenda for the webinar. So at this point, I want to thank you again for attending, and also especially to thank all our speakers and the organisers, and in particular, the Construction Industry Council. I hope you enjoy the webinar, which is being recorded, and we'll make it publicly available in the next few days. So now, without further delay, will hand over to Damien Dacey, who is Deputy Director, Building Safety Programme within the MHCLG. Damien, over to you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. How am I coming through? Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will make a start. So thank you very much for having me here today. I am, many of you may have met my boss. He's Chandra Jasanayeki, who has been a director on the Building Safety Programme for a number of years as part of its establishment and then ongoing running. And he sends his best wishes for today. So I wish to give a few opening remarks to help set the scene a little bit for your discussion. So first of all, let me say a little bit about some of the context, some of the issues that Lindsay has just referred to. Clearly, there are many competent people operating within the built environment. Many organisations every day going about their jobs doing the right thing. But I think we can trace, and I don't have slides, by the way. This is just speaking from notes. I think we can all agree that we can trace a link to the specifics of the fire at Grenfell, the findings of the review into fire safety and building regulations conducted by Dame Judith, by some further fires since Grenfell, and the emerging threads of the current phase of the inquiry. That in all of those situations, the competence of those working in the built environment has played a part of the problems. The lack of a comprehensive, a coherent and consistent approach to raising and sustaining competence across all sectors has had the effect of, amongst other things, undermining the safety of buildings and the trust that those using those buildings, many for their homes, having them. And in her wide-ranging and fundamental review, Dame Judith highlighted that the approach to competence in the built environment is fragmented and siloed. She concluded that there is a lack of formal process for assuring skills and knowledge, experience and behaviours of those engaged at every stage of a building's life cycle. For example, it is common for someone working on a building to only focus on their own area of work, so not consider how this interacts with the wider system of the building, not considering the building holistically, and how seemingly small risk can impact the integrity or safety of the entire building. There is also a lack of consistency in how professionals can evidence or demonstrate competence. This makes it difficult for those appointing professionals to carry out design or building work to know whether those that they are employing really are competent. At worst, the failures of culture and competence leads to the kind of rank and abusive behaviour that we are seeing evidenced in the current proceedings of the Grenfell inquiry. So that's a bit of context. Why don't I move on to talk a bit about the response. So from my point of view, the department has been working with industry and undertaking the necessary statutory reforms to underpin the response to this, to tackle these reforms, and it's a central part of the building safety programme. It has today and continues to be. I have the personal pleasure of working, of recently taking over the team that is responsible for working with Dame Judith and some wonderfully committed leaders from across industry to help identify and now deliver the improvements that are obviously needed. I know lots of parts to this, which obviously we can talk about in more detail. I'm happy to take questions on whether that's the statutory underpinning in the forthcoming building safety bill that will provide new legal powers to mandate competence requirements in building regulations for all buildings and sectors in the built environment, or whether the priority at the very heart of the building safety regulator being established in the Health and Safety Executive, and if you open up the draft bill, section 6 contains provisions that point to the role of the BSR in assisting and encouraging improvement in competence, in the competence of industry. So it's baked right in there as a priority, and other parts of where we are trying to help support, whether it's with the BSI on overarching frameworks and on standards for competence, etc. So this is an investment from the state that is necessary, but it is the case that industry must take ownership of improving standards and culture, and so that change is meaningful and long lasting. So having set the scene a little bit, I will now turn to the issue of accreditation and what you're talking about today in a bit more detail. So where are we coming from on this? So I think I'd say a few things. So the observation would be that without a common set of guidance and standards on what good looks like for the attainment and selection of competent people, it makes it hard, right, impossible for clients and duty holders and residents to know which methods of demonstrating competence, such as qualifications or assessments or other routes, which of those are of value and meaningful. It makes it hard to know whether somebody is truly competent or not. So in its policy response, in our policy response to Dame Judith's review and in the lessons that have been learned since the fire at Grenfell, the government believes that part of the answer involves creating clear, measurable and reliable routes for those working on buildings to demonstrate their competence, and for those choosing competence people to have confidence in those choices, thereby making it, improving the consistency of this across the built environment. And one area in which industry can start to make those changes now is in the space of third-party accreditation. We want to see those who certify competence they are themselves consistent in their approach in achieving the right standard, that this oversight is somewhat independent, thereby helps avoid the risk, as Dame Judith said in a report, of industry marking its own homework. However, this also needs to be proportionate. We see third-party accreditation requirements applying, especially to those working on buildings in scope of the enhanced regime, and not the wider business activities of professional bodies. The emphasis of this should also focus in the first instance on those performing key supervisory roles in the new regulatory regime, such as the principal designer, the principal contractor, the building safety manager. However, we want to encourage the wider industry to start thinking about how to ensure that competence is demonstrated in an independent way, to ensure that independent oversight is embedded within those systems. And this is part of changing culture, and culture change in industry takes time. And this includes not only improving competence standards, but industry showing effective leadership to ensure that building safety and residents are central to their practice and decision making, and that the race to the bottom culture is replaced by one that prioritizes designing, constructing, managing and maintaining buildings of safe and high quality. So we are thrilled, very pleased with the progress that has been made to date, including the work by UKAS and the Engineering Council, to whom we give our thanks for driving this work forward. And whilst I have the mic, I just wanted to highlight the significant leadership shown on the issue of raising competence by the Competence Steering Group, demonstrated most recently in its report setting the bar. And so on industry leadership on the issue of competence more broadly, we absolutely encourage industry to keep going, implementing these recommendations, taking the analysis and the recommendations, turning that into delivery. We fully support that, and not waiting for the legislation to pass in order to do so. And my team are here to help in any way that we can make that a reality. So I hope that's helpful in providing a bit of a perspective from within government on these building safety reforms broadly, on the issues around competence and specifically on accreditation. And I will endeavour to do my best to stick around for the Q&A, and I'll pick up any questions in the chat. Back to you, Jeff.
Damien, thank you very much for that very good opener. I'd like now to hand over to Tim Galloway from the HSE. Tim is Deputy Director of Building Safety, and he's going to update us on the setting up of the Building Safety Regulator. Tim.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just do a sound check? Can everyone hear me? Thank you.
You're not that loud, but we can hear you.
Okay, I'll point my head in the direction of my mic and see if that assists. I do have some slides, and if I could have the first of those slides, please. Some of you will have seen the material I'm about to present before, forgive me, and no doubt some of you will see it again. As usual, I'm working across two screens, so if I'm not looking directly into the camera, it's because I'm reading the notes above me. I'm here in place of Peter, as Lord Lindsay said. Peter's been called away to a meeting, so you're having to put up with the B-list celebrity in this case. If I could move on to the next slide, please. Bear with me 1 second. As Damien said before me, everything that the current bill talks about is very much a draft. It has yet to reach Parliament proper and go through that democratic process. Currently, the bill sets up the building safety regulator within HSE and sets out those 3 key functions that you can read there. I don't anticipate that that will change markedly in the course of the process through Parliament, but again, I just caveat it that this remains draft. Indeed, almost everything I'm going to say has to be viewed in that lens. Next slide, please. I hope you're familiar with HSE. You may have positive, neutral or negative views of us, but one of the things we do bring is the 45 years of experience. And I would argue very strongly that experience of being proportionate and basing our efforts on evidence and seeking to achieve outcomes. And I want us to carry that into our work as the building safety regulator. At the moment, we are building that organisation in shadow phase. The BSR doesn't exist yet. And we're seeking, as part of that shadow phase, to engage in discussions like this with stakeholders out in industry to help us make a regime that will actually be effective and will work properly. One of the things I just wanted to draw attention to very briefly is that principle that's mentioned there, that those who create risk should manage and control it. That's something that goes through occupational health and safety legislation, as you know, and is a principle I think that will work in this environment as well. Next slide, please. While I talk about the stakeholder engagement that this discussion here is part of, we have already been engaged in some time, along with our colleagues in MHCLG, with some groups that are going to be central to delivery of the new regime. You see mention there of the Joint Regulators Group. That has enabled us and MHCLG to engage with partner regulators who are destined to form part of the regime, building control and fire and rescue services. You'll also mention there that mentioned the early adopters. They are drawn from various different parts of the industry and have been helping us to test some of the principles, some of the processes that we're seeking to build within the regime. I should just pause and say that when I talk about industry, I do recognise that that is a very, very broad church, from the design through construction as principal contractors, contractors, the subsets within design, also the new duty holders who will emerge as accountable persons, who will be the people who are operating buildings when they're being occupied. And also, in terms of that broad church of stakeholders, we shouldn't forget residents, who within that word residents is a broad range of people with very different experiences of the homes in which they live. Next slide, please. This is a very simple overview of one of the aspects of the regime. You may have heard discussion of gateways. I acknowledge that this slide is simplistic. It doesn't reflect such things as staged plans or stage occupancy. It's intended to give you a flavour of how the process might work in a linear, simple building, if there is such a thing. So you'll see there are 3 gateways there. Gateway 1 is a planning stage. And as it stands currently, the BSR will be a statutory consultee at that point when plans are submitted to the local planning authority for approval. Gateway 2 is the design stage. That's where, akin to what would be called full plans in the current process, where plans will be submitted to the building safety regulator for consideration. I'll come back to how we'll structure that activity a little later. You'll then get the build. Between Gateway 2 and Gateway 3, it's anticipated there will be a change plan that will document and control how the designs have had to be modified to deal with the reality of the actual construction site. And at Gateway 3, there's then what we now would be regarded as the completion certificate. The BSR will be the building control authority across these stages and will, after those processes, issue a building certificate. That's the certificate that allows you to occupy the building. And managing the building from there on, that goes into a safety case approach, which some of you might be familiar with from major accident hazards. And I'll come back to that a little later too. You'll see along the bottom there mention of the golden thread. If you think on the current CDM health and safety file, then that is one of the kinds of, that's an analogy for what the golden thread will be. Next slide, please. I mentioned that I wanted to come to how we might structure our work as the BSR. You'll see there's a triangle there. Apologies that the script has gone slightly wonky. At the top of that triangle, not in a being the boss way, more in managing the process, is the HC as the BSR. We will appoint a lead inspector, might be someone from BSR, could be from a local regulator, and they will stand up what we call a multidisciplinary team, an MDT, that will involve local building control and will involve local fire and rescue services. They will come together to look at plans, to look at Gateway 3 submissions, and to look at safety cases, and come to an opinion from a regulatory perspective as to whether those plans, etc., can be approved, whether that safety case needs further work in order to give assurance that the building has been designed, built, and can be operated, and is being operated safely. Next slide, please. There's an awful lot of work that has been done and a great deal that is ongoing in relation to standing up the building safety regulator. We do not underestimate within HSE nor within MHCLG the size and complexity of the task that we're engaged in, nor the pressure of time. Let's not forget from Lord Lindsay's opening that it's over 3 years since the fire at Grenfell, and we can't move at leisure. We're not engaged though in a trade-off between pace and quality. We recognise that the regime that comes in on what we call day one is going to develop and develop over time and mature, and that we see actually being a benefit. I want this to be a regime that learns and develops and becomes more efficient, more effective as time goes on. Next slide, please. Just bear with me 1 second. In terms of the BSR objectives, just to repeat those slightly, the first statement there you can see is motherhood and apple pie. That's entirely what the BSR should be aiming to do. I hope you would agree with that. And there is that element of independence that's intended here in terms of design, construction, and occupation of high-risk buildings. We are and will remain HSE, and we will continue to be an independent regulator. And part of this is to re-establish the confidence that colleagues have already said has been lost in the system, to make sure that residents are safe and, as importantly, feel safe in their homes. One of the things I should remark just briefly at this point is, and this is a bit of a well-worn path for me, is that the regulator, though, cannot do this on its own. We've talked for many years in occupational health and safety about the importance of the health and safety system, of which HSE is a part, but it includes insurers, it includes representative bodies, it includes leaders of industry, and in occupational health and safety terms, it also includes employee representatives. I see something very similar here, which I would call the building safety system, and that includes some of the elements I've just described. I see that building safety system being the means by which the cultural change that is needed, that Dame Judith talks about, will actually take effect. The BSR is going to be a key leader in that space, but as people have already mentioned, the kind of leadership we've seen from industry so far that's got things off to a good start, as evidenced by the likes of setting the bar and the work of the CSG, that needs to continue in order for that cultural change to actually embed and remain and be sustained. Next slide, please. One of the key messages I would want you to take away is that although the bill has yet to go through Parliament, and the bill itself is largely an enabling piece of legislation, it will be backed up by a lot of secondary legislation regulations. I'd urge you not to wait for day one. There is a lot of detail to be worked out, but there are some basic principles that have emerged. I've just gone through some of them. that I would urge you to start thinking about now. And I know a great many of you already have. And you can see those there. In terms of competence, the discussion there about safety critical roles and assuring yourself that the people who work for you, be they employees or contractors, have the right skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours. Collecting information. There's probably a great deal of information already at your disposal. It may be in a number of different places. You may already know more than you actually think you know. And collating that material into one place will help you to build the assurance, the evidence that will feed, if you're a future accountable person, into your safety case. And pausing there briefly, the safety case isn't something that you're doing for the regulator. The safety case is your articulation of how you manage the safety of your buildings. And it is important that you have a safety case that reflects what you do and how you keep those buildings safe. And anybody who you come across in your discussions that you have after this who thinks it's just a tick box exercise, I'd urge you to disabuse them of that, because it is very much a system that is your articulation of how you do things. Finally, if you are an accountable person, I'd urge you to look at how you engage with your residents, because they are going to be very much at the heart of this new regime. Next slide, please. If you're in the construction industry or the design industry, then I'd repeat some of the things that Dame Judith really brought out in her report. Words like gaming, people thinking, what can I get away with? I don't anticipate that anybody in this call features in that. But there may be people out there who you know, there may be people you've worked with, who think that the building regulations and building safety is very much in that place. What can I get away with? That's where the cultural change needs to occur. And some of the issues that are coming out of the Grenfell inquiry speak to that. So we don't want to be in a position where we are thinking of the building as something that we deliver and then that's the end of our interest in it. Some of the aspects of the regime have been built around CDM, with which you should be familiar, I would hope, and that's quite deliberate. Clearly, you will want to think about your labour and supply chain and their competence. And in the same way, I'm sure you're already assuring yourself of their occupational health and safety capabilities, assuring yourself of their building safety capabilities is going to be one of the things you will want to do. And I'd urge as well the holistic thinking of building safety and moving away from a tick box exercise that some people reputedly engage in. Next slide, please. Competence is a key pillar of the draft safety bill, as Damien alluded to, and it's not a constant. It's not something you do once and then forget about and move on to other things. It requires to be actively maintained. There needs to be the CPD element. And we, in terms of our 45 years, have helped to build evidence of how competence can be improved within a workforce. It comes down to, as well as the technical aspects of it, the qualifications and things such as that, leadership and culture. And competence needs to be viewed within that context of culture and leadership if it is to be properly maintained. I was speaking yesterday at a conference where I talked about how young people joining the industry need to, from day one, see competence and being competent and maintaining competence as how we do things around here, not just something they get their exams and then nobody ever bothers with their competence again until the day that they leave the industry. It should be a continuous thing, and they should see others around them investing in their competence and investing in their own competence too. Next slide, please. So some thoughts. I mentioned the important work. We do not want to become complacent and think the job is done, either as individual organisations or as representatives of industry. Setting the bar isn't the final word on this, and I know many of the working groups under Setting the Bar are continuing their good work. Clearly, there's and an expectation that those in safety critical roles will receive particular attention. Accreditation, as Damien mentioned, is one of the ways of achieving this. Damien also mentioned that important word, proportionate. And one of the things we're looking forward to as HSE is hearing from yourselves around the area of competence. Going back to one of my earlier remarks, it's very much that we see this being a regime, we want to build one that works and isn't just based in theory, but is a practical regime that will be effective and efficient. Sorry, just bear with me. So in terms of conclusions from what I've said, I'd sum up thus. There's a lot of work that's going into building the regime of which the building safety regulator will be a part, an important part, but it is just a part. And that regime, as I say, needs to be pragmatic and it needs to be effective and efficient. And its objective is to improve the safety of buildings so that residents feel safe. And as previous speakers have mentioned, competence is going to be a key component of that. And competence needs that leadership and that cultural change across the industry. And by that, I mean all that broad church that I talked about, with a view to making Grenfell a thing of the past that we don't see again, but also to make sure that buildings across England are raised, the standards of those buildings are raised, and thus we end up with a better quality of building stock in this country. Many thanks.
Tim, that was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Now we go on to Graham Watts, the Chief Executive of the Construction Industry Council, and also Chair of the Competence Steering Group. So Graham oversaw the publication of the Setting the Bar report. I can't think of anyone better than Graham to take us through that. So Graham, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lord Lindsay. Can you hear me? Is that okay? It's always important to check these things. Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I've got some slides. I think, Liz, you're going to put my slides up, or Kitty? Ah, wonderful, yeah. There was actually an opening slide, which is not there, but it mentioned my role as Chief Executive of CIC and also as Chair of the Competence Steering Group. And I'm really delighted to be here in both of those capacities this morning. Firstly, as Chief Executive of CIC, which for those who don't know is the umbrella body for the built environment professions working together to help confirm and emphasise our close association with UKAS, which is really important to us. And secondly, as the chair of the Competence Steering Group, and obviously I'm going to be saying a good bit about that during the next 20 minutes. Damien, Tim and I are enjoying a welcome sense of déjà vu since the three of us spoke in exactly the same order at yesterday afternoon's Construction Leadership Council Building Safety Workshop. And inevitably, in my case, there is an overlap between the presentation I made there and this morning. So apologies to the few of you who I know were also at yesterday's workshop. However, a lot happens in less than a day, and particularly during this tumultuous year. And at 1 minute past midnight this morning, Parliament published the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee's report into the pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft Building Safety Bill. The report makes excellent reading, even I have to say after a busy day in the wee small hours of this morning. And the committee has given an excellent critique of the draft bill, picking up on the industry's concern about the lack of detail in the primary legislation, the need for greater oversight and teeth, which is important, of course, to this conference, and the crucial issue of scope and the very serious financial problems being faced by leaseholders living in buildings with unsafe cladding. I highly recommend downloading a copy. I hope that by now everyone is aware of Setting the Bar, a report by the industry for the industry, which was published some 6 weeks ago and sets a new competence regime for building a safer future. Many of the organisations here at this webinar, not least UKAS itself, have been instrumental in producing what I hope will become seen to be a seminal report. In his presentation just now, Tim said that setting the bar is not the final word, and he's absolutely right. In fact, I would say it's just the end of the prologue. We haven't even started writing the book yet. Can you move on to the next slide? Setting the bar is the product of something called the Competence Steering Group, which was set up in August 2017, just a few weeks after the Grenfell Tower tragedy, by a body called the Industry Response Group, I beg your pardon, which was established jointly by the MHCLG and a number of sector bodies, including CIC, Build UK, the Construction Products Association, the Local Government Association, National Housing Federation, and the National Fire Chiefs Council. The steering group was paused early on in its work, and some of us morphed into Dame Judith Hackett's review as one of her working groups. And on the day prior to the publication of Building a Safer Future, the Competence Steering Group was reformed to implement her recommendations on improving competence. It has been a massive undertaking. More than 150 organisations have been involved. I don't have any doubt that that's the biggest and broadest alliance of built environment organisations that has ever come together with a common purpose. And it directly engaged over 300 people on its various working groups. A conservative estimate of the industry's investment into this work is not far short of £10 million. A 600-page interim report, Raising the Bar, was published in August 2019, and a widespread consultative process ensued, including 2 very well attended and widely reported consultative conferences. And yet, despite all of this activity, there were still organisations and quite large and important bodies in the professional, the trade and the specialist sectors, which came out of the woodwork in recent weeks declaring that they knew nothing of this work. And by the way, what has it got to do with them? If anything has illustrated the complexity and fragmentation of the built environment sector, then this delayed reaction is surely it. Can you move on to the next slide? Thank you. Setting the Bar is a long report with many recommendations, but in essence, it is based on 2 key principles. Firstly, that all individuals who work on higher risk buildings that could affect safety outcomes or who work unsupervised on these buildings should meet the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours set out in the competence frameworks identified by the report, more of which later. And second, that the approach to improving systems for assessing and assuring competence should involve both a top-down and a bottom-up process. The overarching competence framework developed as part of our work will provide a basis for raising the bar for all individuals across all disciplines. Next slide, please. The bottom-up approach sets a competence framework for each of these sectors. I'm not going to go through them in detail, you'll be pleased to hear. And the framework is explained in the report and outlined in much more detail in a number of annexes. Each framework has been developed by a working group comprising the trade, training and professional bodies in each sector, with a view to those organisations owning the outcomes. And I want to emphasise that it is leadership within each sector that will ensure the delivery of the competence requirements that have been defined. These outcomes will vary from sector to sector. In some cases, the sector has taken a top to bottom, side to side, holistic refurbishment of their whole competence framework. That is true, for example, in the building control, building standards professionals sector. And in others, what is deemed to be necessary is a bolt-on higher level CPD program, for example, in architecture, or a different route towards chartership, as in engineering. The competence framework varies from requiring an overview of dozens of different schemes, such as for installers, or in one case, it involves starting an entirely new profession, and that is, of course, that of the building safety manager. In each case, we now need to move from the design of a blueprint to the implementation and delivery of these enhanced competencies. Can you move on to the next slide? Thank you. The top-down approach is essentially made up of 4 elements. Firstly, a new competence committee sitting within the building safety regulator. And I have to say that the CSG is in a fortunate, if not unique, position of having produced a report with recommendations that are already being implemented, since the new committee is in the draft bill, and we know that the HSE is keen to set this up in shadow form as soon as possible. A national suite of competence standards, where again work is already significantly underway through the BECS work at the British Standards Institution to deliver this recommendation. And the further two strands are arrangements for independent assessment and reassessment against the competence standards, and a mechanism to ensure that those assessing and certifying against the standards have appropriate levels of oversight. And I'll say more about these a little bit later. In relation to these latter recommendations, it's worth noting that the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee's pre-ledge scrutiny of the draft bill, which, as I said, was published earlier this morning, contains in paragraph 8 a ringing endorsement. I didn't have time to put this on a slide at 1 o'clock this morning, but I'll read out what paragraph 108 says. We strongly recommend that the government includes provision in the bill itself for establishing a national system of third-party accreditation and registration for all professionals working on the design and construction of higher-risk buildings. This is a very important point that has been made by many sectors of the industry and has now been picked up by the Select Committee. Can we move on to the next slide? Published alongside Raising the Bar is another comprehensive and equally important report entitled Safer People, Safer Homes, which offers a blueprint for the new role of Building Safety Manager. It is one of over 30 annexes to the CSG's final report. This report goes way beyond the duty of identifying competencies for the Building Safety Manager and effectively sets out the foundations for creating a new professional role. It also receives a strong endorsement from this morning's Select Committee report, which is pressing the government to adopt its recommendations. And as an aside, I want to acknowledge a huge debt of gratitude to Anthony Taylor and his Working Group 8 team for an immense achievement in this sibling report. Can we move on to the next slide? This brings me to the CSG view of accreditation. And an apology to Malcolm Hind, insofar as we haven't had much chance to dovetail our presentations, and I hope I'm not treading on too much of his territory for the following presentation. The CSG has agreed a principles-based approach in determining the extent that third-party assessment should be required of persons working on higher-risk buildings. There is absolute agreement that everyone working on in-scope buildings must work within a system of competence assessment and management to ensure they are competent to deliver safe outcomes. In most instances, the expectation is that demonstrating confidence will be through third-party assessment, where individuals are assessed by an organisation which is independent of the work that the person undertakes. That is to say, in Hackett's terms, they are not marking their own homework. However, it is also recognised that it may not always be practical or necessary to require that every person is third-party assessed, but in such circumstances, non-third-party assessed persons working on higher-risk buildings will always need to be properly supervised. Amongst the report's 59 recommendations are 7 that relate directly to accreditation. Recommendation 7 is to apply stringent assessment of individuals whose work affects safety or who work unsupervised with compliance that is demonstrated by independent third-party assessment. Recommendation 8 is that all individuals whose work on higher risk buildings is likely to materially affect safety outcomes or who work unsupervised on these buildings should meet the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours set out in the competence frameworks developed by the industry. Recommendation 9 is for a robust system of reassessment to ensure that people have maintained their competence in relation to the work they are registered or certified to undertake, and have a plan to develop new competencies where necessary. The frequency of reassessment may vary between disciplines, but it should be at least every 5 years. Recommendation 10 is to improve existing arrangements for assessing and reassessing competence, which in the main are delivered through certification and professional registration, to include as a minimum the competencies needed for working on higher risk buildings. Recommendation 14 is the equivalent to recommendation 7, applying stringent assessment for organisations in those sectors where third-party assessment is carried out at the company level, where the requirements will need to set out clearly how the competence of the individuals carrying out the work is assessed and how they are managed and supervised. Recommendation 15 concerns the oversight of assessors to ensure that all organisations carrying out the assessment and reassessment of competence should themselves be subject to a rigorous system of oversight for their activities in relation to higher risk buildings, which Dame Judith referred to as accrediting the accreditors. This should be undertaken by a body such as UKAS or the Engineering Council, or another body able to demonstrate equivalent standards of accreditation or licensing. And finally, recommendation 16 is for mandatory registration or certification of persons working on higher risk buildings to be registered or certified by a recognised professional certification body. And I'm sure that Malcolm will unpack these recommendations in more detail in the UKAS response to follow. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Our work began with the intention of implementing the recommendations of Building a Safer Future. And so what did Dame Judith Hackett have to say about setting the bar? This is an extract from her letter to me as CSG chair following publication of the report last month. She said, the way ahead for all parts of industry involved in the built environment is now very clear, and I emphasise, we must move on to delivery. Whilst the priority must be to raise competence amongst all those working on high-rise residential buildings in line with the new regulatory regime, it is our firm belief, and she's referring to the Industry Safety Steering Group here, that work must not stop there. Increased competence across the whole sector needs to extend to every part of the industry to deliver the safety and quality that people expect and deserve. And these issues are picked up strongly in the Select Committee report published earlier today. Can we move on to the next slide? Raising and setting the bar is the end of the beginning of a process, as I said at the beginning. The key next steps are now leadership and delivery. And these are just some of the questions that I believe the industry needs to be addressing. I think it's very important when we talk about the balance between what government and industry need to do, is to say that meeting regulations should be a given, and it should be the very minimum that the industry achieves. And so how do we ensure the delivery of competencies that go well beyond just meeting the requirements of legislation? People have a right to be safe and feel safe in the buildings that we design, construct, manage and refurbish. And that must be equally true of every building. As the industry, we must be absolutely clear that this is our fundamental obligation. And to the government, I think we should back the key message from the Select Committee that there needs to be a national system of third-party accreditation and registration with teeth for the key roles in safety critical occupations on higher risk buildings. The last slide, please, Liz. This is a web link where the report and all of its annexes can be accessed, and I'm sure that it will be made available to all attendees after the webinar. Thank you very much for your attention.
Graham, that was first class. Thank you very much indeed on behalf of us all. Thank you also for giving us an update on the Select Committee report that came out just after midnight early this morning. So that was also hugely relevant to today's discussions. So moving on from Graham, we now turn to UKAS for a presentation on how accreditation will be deployed in response to setting the bar. And I want therefore to hand over to Matt Gantley, the Chief Executive at UKAS, and also Malcolm Hind, External Affairs Advisor at UKAS. So Matt and Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Could I just test you can hear me clearly?
Yep.
Excellent, thank you. Well, very much a good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Gantley, as Jamie's mentioned, and I'm the Chief Executive of UKAS. Firstly, may I give a very warm welcome to almost 200 delegates who've registered and attended today's joint events between UKAS and the Construction Industry Council. Can I give thanks to the CIC team and the UKAS team for pulling this all together. So I'm going to be talking to you about how accreditation can build a safer future, and we hope this will be a very practical and useful event to make practical progress, as Graham has mentioned, towards delivery. We also just give a quick note to say that in 20 minutes we're going to have a plenary discussion session with questions and answers. I can see already there's been a lot of chat. Please use that chat facility to raise any questions, which I'll facilitate at the end of this presentation. Before passing over to my colleague Malcolm Hind, who's dedicated the majority of his time over the past 2 years to supporting the competence steering groups, I would like to give you an overview of who UKAS is and what we do. Next slide, thank you. So UKAS is the national accreditation body. We are appointed by government to accredit organisations that carry out all types of conformity assessment activities. In short, our role is to check the checkers. We can trace our history back to 1966, but we were consolidated as a single entity as UKAS in 1995, and so this year we celebrate our 25th anniversary. We are a not-for-profit, non-profit distributing organisation, and we're appointed as the national accreditation body by the Accreditation Regulations of 2009, which will very shortly be placed wholly into UK law at the end of the EU transition period. We employ 265 full-time staff and 190 assessment managers, with over 700 external technical assessors who represent our technical specialisms in areas such as construction, engineering, safety, and fire safety. In a normal year, we would deliver around 31,000 assessment days, which gives you a feel of the size of our organisation. We have over 3,000 accredited organisations across a wide range of activities, from medical testing to lifting inspection to quality management certification. We work to a range of international standards, as we will discuss here in more detail in the breakout sessions, that sets the framework and the requirements for the different types of conformity assessment. But what is accreditation? Accreditation is the ongoing formal recognition of the competence, impartiality, and integrity of conformity assessment bodies to perform a specific conformity assessment task. That could be testing, for example, with construction products, or inspection, for example, with fire doors, or certification, such as PAS 2030 for the Green Homes Grant, and also with verification and validation. But the common objective of all of our work is to provide an assurance of the integrity, competence, and consistency of the checkers, the conformity assessment bodies and process. Next slide, please. This graphical illustration of UKAS's role, which again we will come back to, clearly differentiates the difference between accreditation and certification, and that's a very important distinction. We are appointed to our role as a public authority activity by the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. As a not-for-profit organisation, we also have 18 members who are, for all intents and purposes, our shareholders. They provide the ultimate governance and decision-making authority at UKAS. The Health and Safety Executive is one of those members at the very heart of our own governance. As I've mentioned, UKAS accredits the conformity assessment activity, which gives confidence in the products, systems, services, or personal competence. This diagram shows that standards and scheme criteria or scheme requirements are important too. Because of the broad range of activities that we cover, we work closely with standards bodies and scheme owners to ensure that standards and requirements can be consistently implemented. Although it is not our role to create standards, we play an active role in supporting the development of standards and ensuring that they help to drive improvement in competence and ensuring that it is done in a proportionate way, just as Tim has mentioned earlier on. Next slide, please. One thing that you will hear from the breakout groups is that UKAS already has extensive activity in the construction sector, but there are important gaps that the Setting the Bar report currently points to. But currently, we work in construction products and their testing, for example, with certification bodies such as BSI, BRE, and BBA, with the competent person schemes, with certification bodies such as CertSure or NAPIT, with the Gas Safe Register and the personal certification of that scheme, with the BAE fire extinguishers, alarms and lighting systems, microgeneration, energy efficient installation, the energy performance of buildings directive schemes, which is underway for accreditation, highway sector schemes, the SSIP scheme, management systems, and forthcoming building information modeling. So there's a broad range of ways in which construction sector is served by accreditation and will be in the future. We welcome Setting the Bar report, particularly those recommendations around the need for third-party assessment of individuals and the independent oversight of assessing organisations. We believe that this level of assessment is justified in these safety critical sectors, and that UKAS accreditation and the assessment process can make a major contribution to the culture change required. We're convinced that third-party assessment of individuals who work on higher risk buildings will provide a greater focus on the competence required. But the organisations carrying out the assessments also need to be competent. Accreditation provides independent assurance that this is the case, ensuring that the industry is not marking its own homework. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Malcolm, who's going to give us our response to the recommendations of Building a Safer Future report and how we take that forward. Over to you, Malcolm.
Yes, thank you, Matt. And perhaps somebody could shout if they can't hear me very well, but I hope the technology is working. Yes, my name is Malcolm Hind. I work as an external affairs advisor for UKAS, and it's been my privilege over the last 2 years to be a member of the Competence Steering Group and to lead UKAS's work in responding to Dame Judith Hackett's review. As we've already heard, Setting the Bar is the industry response to Dame Judith's review of building regulations and fire safety. And key recommendations in Dame Judith's report covered the need for a more consistent approach to assessment and reassessment of competence of those working on higher risk buildings, and the need for accreditation of the bodies carrying out the assessment and reassessment processes. The Competence Steering Group spent a considerable amount of its time looking at how these recommendations should be addressed. So the Setting the Bar report contains several sections on assessment and oversight, as Graham has already indicated, as well as a number of recommendations specifically addressing these points. The danger of speaking last, of course, is that there is a danger that some of your content has already been displayed, as Graham suggested, but I would like to just run through those recommendations with you to provide some context to the UKAS response. So first of all, recommendation 7, calling for the independent third-party assessment of all those whose work on higher risk buildings materially affects safety or who work unsupervised. And this is linked very closely with recommendation 8, calling for all such individuals to meet the competence frameworks developed by industry. These two recommendations respond directly to Dame Judith's findings that there is no consistent way to assess or verify the competence of people working on higher risk buildings. I should stress at this point that these recommendations are aimed specifically at those working on higher risk buildings. This supports the proposals also in the draft Building Safety Bill for a tighter regulatory regime for those buildings defined as higher risk. So it's not the intention to require third-party assessment for all those working in the built environment. We're focusing our efforts on those working on higher risk buildings. And then this is coupled also with recommendation 9, which is looking for a robust system of periodic reassessment. And this, of course, is to ensure that competence is maintained. And the recommendation in the report is that reassessment should be carried out at least every 5 years. But of course, in many sectors, there is already an expectation of reassessment at shorter periods than 5 years. Next slide, please. Recommendation 10, suggesting that existing arrangements for assessing and reassessing competence, which at the moment is mainly delivered by certification bodies and professional institutions. These existing methods should be used and improved to cover the competencies needed for working on higher risk buildings. And I guess it's fairly obvious this is to avoid the unnecessary costs related to establishing new systems and organisations. There are many organisations out there, certification bodies and professional institutions, already carrying out assessment in similar fields. So we want to utilise and build on that existing expertise. And then moving on to recommendation 14, which covers competence at an organisational level. And in some sectors, the assessment of competence at an organisational level is an already recognised process. And where this is the case, a similar system of robust assessment will be required. Of course, focusing on the competence of the individuals carrying out the work. Like Dame Judith's report, the work of the CSG has focused mainly on individual competence. But this recommendation is recognition that for some trades and professions, organisational competence is important too. This work is less well developed, I would say, but will need to be addressed more closely as we move forward. And the next slide, please. This covers recommendation 15, which suggests that all organisations carrying out the assessment and reassessment should be subject to a rigorous system of oversight undertaken by a body such as UKAS or Engineering Council. And this really is the nub of the issue that we're talking about today, recognising that in order that we can have confidence in the assessment process, those organisations carrying out the assessments need to be subject to independent oversight too. UKAS and the Engineering Council are working closely together to make sure that the oversight they provide is consistent and fit for purpose. And then finally, recommendation 16 calls for the government to mandate the registration or certification of persons working on high risk buildings. And this was thought necessary to ensure that all those working on high risk buildings are assessed by an independent organisation. It remains to be seen how government will respond to this recommendation, but there was a strong feeling in the Competence Steering Group that the required culture change would not be achieved if compliance to these requirements remains voluntary. And as Graham has explained, it's very interesting to hear that the Select Committee has reinforced this particular recommendation. So these are the main recommendations relating to assessment and accreditation. But the question, of course, is how should they be delivered in practice? So if we can move on to the next slide. Given the breadth of technical disciplines covered by this work, as Graham has already said, the Competence Steering Group has been supported by 13 working groups looking at the different trades and professions involved with high risk buildings. We're going to look more closely at the output of each of the working groups in breakout session 2 later on this morning. But suffice to say at this point, WG0 developed overarching recommendations about the assessment of competence and recommended the need for 4 national standards. First of all, for an overarching competence framework, and then for the 3 key regulated roles: principal designer, principal contractor, and building safety manager. If I can jump to the bottom of the list, WG12 is looking at ways of assuring good product knowledge across all sectors. So in a way, this is a horizontal group as well. But the other 11 working groups have all been working on competence criteria for their particular trade or profession. And most have published the basic criteria in the Setting the Bar report. But there is still work to be done to determine how assessment against the criteria will be carried out and how the assessment process will be overseen. This is the key next step, and we hope that this webinar will help move this process forward. So on to the next slide, please. So what is UKAS's response to setting the bar? Well, we think that the recommendations contained in setting the bar, plus the work carried out in the working groups, present a really good blueprint for moving forward. And if implemented properly, would contribute significantly towards the culture change required. And UKAS is very willing to play its part. However, UKAS can't work in isolation. We need the cooperation of industry, government, and other key stakeholders. With that cooperation, we believe we can build a system that will provide a consistent method of assessing competence in this important sector. We work to tried and tested standards that can be applied in this sector as they have in many others. So to take the recommendations in setting the bar forward, we will need to work with third-party assessment organisations to look closely at their proposals for assessment in any particular technical area, to make sure that the proposals are based on robust competence criteria developed by industry, and consider whether they are supported by an appropriate assessment methodology. The assessing organisations will also need to demonstrate that their proposals meet the requirements of the relevant international standard. So assessment can be carried out in a number of different ways and by different types of organisation. We expect the main interest in this work to come from those professional institutions and certification bodies that are already active in the sector. So, and also, as we've touched on briefly, assessment can be of the individual or of an organisation or a combination of the two. Professional institutions clearly focus on the individual competence. Certification can be of an individual or an organisation. But the principles of accreditation remain the same, whichever approach is adopted, to ensure impartiality, technical competence, and consistency of outcome, regardless of who carries out the assessment. So, in conclusion, UKAS strongly supports the recommendations contained in setting the bar. We stand ready to work with any assessing organisation to take this programme of work forward to provide greater confidence in the competence of those working in this vital sector of the construction industry. As Graham mentioned, Dame Judith and the ISG and MHCLG at ministerial level have all strongly supported the need for independent oversight and the role of UKAS. And we hope this webinar will help to move this work programme forward. So at this point, I'd hand back to start the Q&A session.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Malcolm. As Malcolm said, we now have around 15 minutes for questions and answers. So can I ask all our speakers to join our virtual panel? I also want to introduce at this stage two further panelists. Katie Turf, who is Head of Professional Standards at the Engineering Council, and Stephen Adams, Chief Executive of the BAFE Fire Safety Register. They're important additions to our panel, as the Engineering Council is referred to in the Setting the Bar report as an organisation that can provide independent oversight, and BAFE is an organisation that has worked closely with UKAS for many years. So a warm welcome to you both. As mentioned previously, please submit your questions using the chat function and Matt, if you're able to, we'll get through as many of these questions and comments as time permits. But Matt, you're going to facilitate this Q&A session, and I think direct questions to the appropriate panelists. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Jamie. Yes, I'll do my best to facilitate that. Thank you very much so far for all the questions that have come through. I'm looking through them now to see which are the best ones to kind of make sure that we make the best use of time and get all of the panelists to speak. One of the big points that's come through, in particular from a range of the questions, thank you very much, Debbie, for your points. It relates to standards development process. Would you mind, perhaps Damien, or actually Beth Dunning from MHCLG, I think you're also on the call, would you be able to talk to us, give a little bit more detail on the development now of the Flex standard and how that process has evolved, how the consultation process is working for the development of that standard?
Yeah, I can answer. I think I put an answer in the chat, but if people haven't seen that, essentially we're working with BSI to develop a number of standards, kind of a suite of standards, and we're focusing this on the overarching competence framework standard first, which is aimed at all professionals working on high-risk buildings, and this will essentially form a blueprint for different professional bodies and trade associations to look at their competence frameworks and assess it against the key skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours set out in the BSI standard. And then we're also working on 3 separate PASs for the key roles at principal designer, principal contractor and building safety manager, and they will kind of kick off next year. Building safety manager 1 aiming to kick this off in January because of just the importance of the role. So part of that standards work, BSI will be making sure this is mapped to different ISO standards, which I think Debbie mentioned in her comment, and they are kind of conducting their consultation now. It is closed and they are looking through all of the comments they've received. Yeah, I think you put 631, but I think it's actually more than that. I think it's about 800 comments, and which just shows the interest in this area. And this week, actually, the Flex panel is going through each of the recommendations and kind of seeing what to do with all of those. So hopefully in November, early December, we'll be able to release a new version of the Flex standard to then have another consultation, because that's how the Flex works. It's like continuously consulting until you reach the final package, whereas standards before, they normally wait till the end and they get a flood of comments. This is a new way that BSI have been doing them. So yes, I believe they'll be made public as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Beth. Tim from the HSC, obviously this is a very important development of this standard, the Flex standard. Do you have anything to add to that in terms of the consultation, the structure, the process, the timeline?
No, other than to say HSC's been involved in the process, the BEX level, and also we'll be looking at the drafts material as it starts to come forward and may put in our own perspectives on it.
Thank you. And so while I've got you, Tim, can I just point to, I guess it's more of a comment that's come in from David McLaughlin, which relates to that persons working on buildings that are not defined as higher risk obviously do not need the specific competency requirements focused on those on the higher risk buildings, but employees should take the view that competence is broader than just the specific remit of high risk buildings. What do you say to that broader message of the importance of competence within buildings more generally beyond the high risk category?
Well, I think it's key that to reflect that what we're trying to do, I think, as a country here, is improve the quality of buildings across the board, whether they fall into the scope of HRBs, higher risk buildings, or they don't. There are, as a result of the legislative regime when it's finalised, will probably be particular standards and a stringency about work in HRBs that isn't formally applied in other areas. But I think it was Dame Judith who said this. It was, I think, Graham who reminded me of this. The anticipation that there would be overspill or bleed across out of HRBs into the wider built environment. And I think it is a slightly motherhood and apple pie statement, but anybody who works on a building should be competent to make sure that the work that they do is safe. And I would not want to be in a position where we see the kind of events that we've seen in Chelsea recently and other places, translated not in terms of temporary works leading to the unfortunate collapse of a building, thankfully nobody was hurt, but into actual structures. And there have been some rare occasions where actual structures in this country have collapsed, thankfully few, but we see overseas the kinds of occurrences where people are killed, injured, and significant damage to property from buildings that are poorly constructed. And I wouldn't want that to become something that we have to deal with in this country. Thus, the competence of people who work on buildings from the 2-story house up to the 23, 24-story building, to me, is something that we would want to see improved and want to see move forward.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'd like to move to a question and bring in Steve Adams from BAIF. Steve, you've for many years led an organisation that as a scheme owner of standards has delivered accreditation across those certification bodies. Mark Pashby has mentioned a point to do with the reassessment frequency. He's personally a BAIF SB 205 scheme certified person. So could you just talk to the frequency of which it is appropriate to reassess on an ongoing basis?
Yes, hello Matt. We believe that constant reassessment, and our schemes in the main specify at least annually, although in the first 12 months of a company gaining registration through third-party certification, it can be 6 monthly while the company gets themselves organised. So it is, you can't, in the area of safety, because this involves both company organisations that deliver that and the people that they employ, you can't just do a once and only. Techniques change, products change, buildings change, and it's absolutely essential that companies are reassessed, because even the current legislation talks about regular fire risk assessments, and buildings change. I worry slightly, and certainly at the start of the Hackett working groups, the concentration was just on construction. We see many more fires, in fact, taking place when there's refurbishments going on and during the life cycle of the building. And I think it's absolutely vital that we consider the whole life cycle of the built environment, not just the initial construction phase, which is important, but it's what we people do to buildings and change the usage, change the occupancy, that can often lead to problems. So regular reassessment of the building and regular assessment of the companies and people that deliver that is absolutely key.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's excellent. I'd like to move on and bring in Katie Turf. Katie is, as Jamie's mentioned, the head of professional standards for the Engineering Council. Katie, we have a question from Richard Fowler, and it's a simple, straightforward question, and it allows us to show the way in which UKAS and the Engineering Council are going to work together. How do you choose an appropriate accreditation body? What's the decision process that they will go through, we will go through?
So there are similar principles that UKAS and Engineering Council use in terms of their accreditation and licensing process, but they're quite different structures of organisations. So for Engineering Council, the third-party accreditation or licensing in our case is actually for bodies in the engineering sector, and normally those are professional bodies to be licensed by us, or they would need to become licensed members and have the appropriate processes in place, but they would also need to be assessing to the engineering standard. So we have UK Spec, which is the generic standard for engineers and technicians. We are looking at developing a contextualised standard, which will be specific to engineers working in the building safety context. But we, for bodies to come to the Engineering Council, they would need to be within the engineering footprint. And they would either need to be eligible to become licensed members, or they could potentially have a registration agreement with one of the existing licensed members if, for example, only a small proportion of the people they cover are within the engineering footprint. So there are different options there, but really the scope for Engineering Council is bodies working in the engineering sector rather than broader.
Okay, and we have the opportunity in the breakout sessions to cover that in a lot more detail. Thank you, Katie. I'd like to bring Graham back in here. Actually, a question from Wayne Terry at the Association of British Certification Bodies. Graham, to achieve consistency within the industry, and of course with the CIC, such a broad church of construction bodies that you work with and represent. Will there be sector schemes developed, occupational schemes developed? How will that come through in terms of response to the flex standard ultimately?
I don't think there's an easy or simple answer to that, actually. Just as with the point about the length of the period of time before reassessment, I think these things are going to depend upon the sector themselves. And obviously, one hopes that there would be alignment within the sectors, and that alignment would be brought about by existing and I hope in some cases new structures. So, for example, the engineers already have the Engineering Council as a force for creating alignment between very different disciplines. You know, the disciplines of fire engineering, civil engineering, building service engineering are very different, but they're actually brought together and there is a sense of alignment through the Engineering Council. It's obviously going to be very difficult in some areas. In the installation area, for example, we know already that there are dozens of different schemes. The key point is they will have to meet the benchmarks that are being set in the British Standard and in the work of Working Group 2. So, and in other areas, there aren't a lot of schemes. There are just one or two very well accepted schemes which will continue and will build a higher level in terms of the competencies set by the relevant working group to the setting the bar report. So there's not an easy answer to that, apart from the fact that there needs to be as much alignment as possible, and there are frameworks that are being put in place that will enable that alignment to have a structure. Thank
you very much, Graham. I'd like to, Beth, you've actually answered this question, but I think it's very relevant to everybody here. The question I think came in from, excuse me, I think I've lost it there. So from Charlotte Lee. A number of panelists have mentioned the safety critical roles. Have they been defined, and if not, who will define these and when? Beth, would you mind giving from MHCLG's point of view where we're at, particularly in the critical role of principal contractor, principal designer, and the building safety manager?
Yeah, sorry, I keep answering the questions in the chat as I'm going down.
No,
that might be helpful. So essentially, these are the key duty holder roles within the new system. However, we use safety critical to encompass the building safety manager as well, because it's not a duty holder role. Essentially, these are the roles in the new system that will have additional responsibilities and oversight for safety at key parts of a building's life cycle. So you have your principal designer in the design phase, principal contractor, construction phase, and then also building safety manager in the occupation. So it's not necessarily saying these are more safety critical than others. It's just saying that they have to be thinking holistically about the whole building in their oversight because they have these such key roles. But yeah, we've not necessarily defined that as such in the legislation. It's just we speak about duty holders, but again, because the building safety manager is not a duty holder, we feel like their involvement is key to the safety of the building as well at that time. But we expect everyone not to be working in a silo and to have a whole building approach when they are working in buildings, because I think that was part of the failings that Dame Judith identified in her review as well. But I don't know if Tim wants to say anything on that as well, because I know he spoke about safety critical roles in his presentation.
Thank you, Beth. Tim?
Well, certainly Beth talks about the specific roles that are discussed in the legislation, BSM, Principal Contractor, Principal Designer. We also need to think about the other end of things and not to cast the net on these things too wide. Any system that we develop has to think about potential unintended consequences as well. And thus, we don't want to be in a position, for example, where because we think, well, anybody who works on a HRB by definition is safety critical, thus residents can't paint their own apartments, because that strays towards being disproportionate. And similarly, we wouldn't want to be in a system where, because of the way we design this approach overall, we end up with people who live in a 7-story plus block having to pay a tariff effectively that their friend living in a 6-story block doesn't have to pay, because they're having to pay for all of the apparatus that we have put around this. That's not to say that we water down the system. It just means that we keep in mind the actual practical implications, and also recognise that what we within this context see as a perfectly reasonable approach, as we have seen already in this environment, may be taken by others outside of this community and applied in a disproportionate way. And you know, we've seen that in the HRB context, where things in around cladding that have been applied to tower blocks have then been translated and applied to all buildings, and demands placed on homeowners that it's actually impossible for them to satisfy. And I just mention that to make sure that we are cognizant of that, because we are building a regime here for the future, and it must be sustainable. And sustainability means it must be effective in raising standards, but also effective in that it actually can be managed by the country as a whole and all the players within it.
Thank you very much, Tim. And with that, we'll have to, I'm afraid, make that our last question. Thank you to everybody for your questions. We will at the CIC and UKAS look at the questions, particularly those we might not have answered, with a view to bringing them into the following sessions for more detailed discussion. So thank you everyone for your questions, at which point I'll pass back to Jamie, and I'll see everybody in the breakout sessions later on this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you to all our panelists and those who put questions to them. This now brings us to the end of the main plenary part of today's proceedings. We'll take a short break until 11:40. You then have the option of joining one of 2 breakout groups, which will provide an opportunity for a more interactive discussion, and they'll be able to go into more detail than we've been able to do in the plenary session. Just to remind you, breakout group 1 will be facilitated by UKAS under the title Demystifying the Accreditation Process, also facilitated by the Engineering Council. It's particularly aimed at those organisations who have not previously been involved with accreditation or third-party oversight and are therefore new to the subject. And breakout group 2 under the title Developing Certification Schemes. This will be facilitated by UKAS and is intended for those organisations who are more familiar with accreditation and who may be considering extending their existing accredited scope or setting up new schemes in response to setting the bar report. You'll find the login details for each of these breakout groups in the programme for today, so we much look forward to seeing you in one or other of those breakout groups. Finally, I'd like to thank you for attending. On behalf of UKAS and CIC, you obviously have a real interest in the subject, and it is hugely relevant. I'd like to thank the CIC administrators, Liz and Kitty, for their hard work behind the scenes. And finally, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to this morning's guest speakers. So thank you all. Enjoy a short break, and we'll see you for one or other of the breakout groups. Goodbye.